Welcome to the first Continental Conversations in Trinity. Thank you so much for coming, especially with the weather being so fuzzy and confusing today. It's really fuzzy. It would be great if we had someone who could help disambiguate this weather. Just putting that out there. Yeah, it's going to be a really, really good term. We have 4 of these events going. We have some great people. So please look out for them. Just a quick notice, our week 6 Continental Conversations, which usually happens on a Thursday, will be happening on a Friday, most likely. But just know that week 6 might be different, so remember that if that is important to you. Aside from that, yeah, we have a really, really good term. Thank you very, very much for coming. I want to introduce our speaker very quickly. This is Patrick. Do you consider yourself a 3rd year? Yeah. He's on his year abroad right now. He's from LMH, and you study French and English. Yeah. And he'll be speaking about Roland Barthes. The talk should last between 20 and 25 minutes, and then we can move to a period of discussion and questions and points and defenses and objections. And to help prompt that, at the back of the handout, there are a list of questions. So do look at those. If any are exciting or anything like that, we can talk about them during the period designated for that. And yeah, if you want to at the end, we have numbers. We could also go to the pub to continue the conversation. And yeah, that's really all from me. Let's welcome Patrick.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing the Continental Conversations. I think they've been great so far. Today we're going to be talking about Roland Barthes, whose life and work is, I found out while writing this, is quite difficult to summarize. He's one of the few thinkers of the 20th century who's without legitimate intellectual heirs, but his influence still reaches almost all corners of theory. He's inspired thinkers like Derrida, Christeva, Deleuze, Baudrillard, and Eco. If I was a writer and dead, wrote Barthes, I'd like my life to be reduced, thanks to the care of a friendly biographer, to a few details, a few tastes, a few inflections. Let's call them biographies. So to begin, I'll play the role of the friendly biographer. Barthes was a systematic thinker that worked against systems. He was a gay Protestant. He was an intellectual, an interdisciplinary intellectual before such a term existed. He was a lover of Havana cigars, despite their bourgeois inflections, and as I'm sure you all know, he announced the death of the author. He wrote on everything from anthropology, theories of the self, linguistics, semiology, photography, all of which have established him as one of the real maîtres à penser. But most importantly for today, he straddled with ease and poetic flair the bridge between structuralism and post-structuralism. So with this sort of intellectual breadth in mind, today I'll be focusing on myth, ideology, and meaning, and how this kind of changes before and after this transitional post-structuralist period. I think first we should establish what Barthes means when he says reading. He's always talking about reading the world. For Barthes, the text includes far more material than the graphic marks on the page. A text is anything that can be read. The whole world becomes a text for him. For Barthes as well, all writing is normative, not in the sense that it prescribes for us what is normal, though it often does, but for the very fact that any text is underpinned by a particular value system that will be picked up in varying degrees by readers and inflect their particular phenomenological experience of reality, the text of reality. So on to myth. Between 1954 and 1956, Barthes wrote a monthly feature called Petite Mythologie de moi. He started this project because, and I quote, he resented seeing nature and history confused at every turn in accounts of contemporary life. He discussed mass culture and sought to analyse the social stereotypes that are passed off as natural, the kind of what goes without saying in life, our rites, our rituals. And he says these are ultimately ideological impositions. So what does Barthes mean by myth? The word myth comes from the ancient Greek mythos, meaning speech, narrative, fiction, or plot. But Barthes is not talking about Oedipus or Jason the Argonauts or something like that. He's talking about everyday things and theorizing them as a system of signs. The cultural work, he said, done in the past by gods and epic sagas is now done by laundry detergent commercials and commercial strip characters. So in the book, there were essays about wrestling, the semiotically dense nature of washing powder, the ubiquity of plastic, the most postmodern of materials for him, and the perplexing, desexualized nature of stripping, even for the voyeur. But the overarching thesis of these analyses is that the logic of capital has populated our world with myth, and he sees this as a particularly insidious form of ideology. Myth, this might help, functions as a synonym of ideology similar to the Althusserian interpolation or false consciousness set out by Marx and Engels. Myth calls out to the person who receives it like a command or statement of fact, and in this way for Barthes, the human subject is constituted by the desires and messages stirred by these myths. But what's so unique about that? What's unique about his idea of myth qua ideology? I think the answer can be found in the fundamental linguistic semiological approach that he uses. You'll see in the handout I've given, he calls one concept provided by de Saussure, which describes the connection between an object, the signified, and its linguistic representation, the signifier, so a word, for example. For Saussure, language as a whole is composed of a langue, which is a system of signs that allows the construction of words in oppositional phonological play, and that is the structure behind what he calls balun, the actual experience of speaking. And although Barthes found this helpful at first when looking at myth, he says actually there's a second order of meaning. We have the signifier and the signified, but there's also something that he calls denotation, which refers to the literal or explicit interpretation of the sign, such as a photograph which represents a person in shock. But there's also the connotation, an additional meaning which usually expresses an emotional value. So, for example, green, it's a color, but it can also be used to describe envy, for example. The word semiology, before it was repurposed by Saussure, originally meant the investigation of medical symptoms in disease. And I think in a similar way, Barthes returns to both of the definitions. He uses the signification process in order to examine the symptoms of a kind of mythic sickness swelling in society. And in doing so, Barthes argues, like I said earlier, that myths impose ideologies unconsciously on us. Myth is a second order semiological system. That's to say that myth is a sign that uses a pre-existing sign for its signifier. Okay, that's a little bit complicated, I think. So on the handout, we have a little bit of a childish example, but the rose example. So at the top here we have the signifier rose, that's the literal R-O-S-E that we write down, and the signified is a real life rose. Just below we have the denotation and the connotation I just spoke about. What myth does is it appropriates a pre-existing sign as it is above and suggests some sort of belief. So here we have, again, an example, all you need is love. That romance through the rose says all you need is love. Myth is parasitical to language. Myths differ from other kinds of signifiers because they're never arbitrary. They always contain some kind of analogy which motivates them. Myth doesn't really hide anything, it just distorts things. It requires the meaning of the initial sign for its power, but kind of denatures it. Something that was once contingent becomes natural. But you'll be glad to know that myth isn't always as banal as the rose example. Myth making manipulates desire that prized currency in our libidinal and financial economies. We might think, for example, of myths generated around ideas of the church, the family. Nowadays we have the myth of fair trade goods, the political party, national identity, capitalism. So here we might think of Walter Benjamin's insight that a religion may be discerning capitalism. That is to say that capitalism serves essentially to allay the same anxieties, torments, and disturbances to which the so-called religions offered answers. And I think if Barthes and Benjamin were in conversation, they would completely agree that myth papers over the inconsistencies in our realities, providing alibis for the traumatic elements of particular governing systems. But the next point, I think, is Barthes' most radical kernel. He writes that if myth and ideology pervade and infest the very language system that we use to communicate, proliferating in our unconsciousness, then how are we to act as autonomous and moral agents if myth short circuits the very language we use to speak, to communicate? And Barthes begins to feel a certain distrust towards language in general. It's no longer a transparent system, it's something that's being appropriated and damaged. The very language system is being damaged by governing structures. He declares that language is fascist, that language under this mythic pressure is neither reactionary nor progressive. It is simply fascist. For fascism does not consist in preventing to say, but in obliging to say. Barthes argues that the very grammar of myth destroys or redefines verbs. It inflates substantive nouns. Myth here has a particular political use. Capitalism needs myth in order to stop the transformation of society. Myth injects the appearance of permanence provided by this language structure. It makes capitalist conditions, seem like they're eternal in the very language that we speak. And here we might think of a quote of disputed origin that, you know, the end of the world is easier to imagine than the end of capitalism. Because, you know, myth removes history from language. It makes particular signs appear natural or eternal. And if myth can function in this way, which it does, then how are we to imagine the end of capitalism? In a more overtly political example that he uses, Barthes cites a cover of the openly racist French magazine Paris Match, and on the front it depicts a young black soldier in French uniform giving the military salute, his eyes fixed on the French tricolor, the national flag. On the first level of signification, we see that, you know, there are shapes and colours, and we see it to mean that there is a young black soldier in French uniform. Okay. But Barthes also sees that there's this implicit message that France is a great empire, the imperial project was justified and good, that all her sons, without any colour discrimination, are unified and serve faithfully under the flag. This myth is very successful for the detractors of, there's no better answer to the detractors of colonialism than myths like this, which purport to be innocent, but there's this kind of darkness which belies them. And indeed, the fact that there do exist black soldiers in the army gives a certain naturalness. Its defenders could claim that it's simply a picture of a black soldier, nothing more. For Barthes, this type of bad faith, of this persistent alibi, is one of the things that he finds most objectionable about myth. Because myth functions not only as a set of ideas or beliefs, but also reaffirms or creates unconscious fantasies and desires that structure our perception of reality. For Barthes, we're not passive recipients of ideology, but active participants in its perpetuation. So here we see that by the time Mythology is published, Barthes is very much still following a structuralist approach. He thinks it works, and in part it is successful in formalizing a kind of logical structure behind to show how myth functions. But as he moves towards the second half of his career, he sees that it could never be a strict scientific endeavor. So along with Derrida, Barthes begins to identify the flaw of structuralism, namely its reliance on a transcendental signified. There's a definition on the handout. The transcendental signified is a symbol of constant universal meaning. It's an orienting point in a closed-off system that allows other meanings to make sense. But since there are no symbols of constant and universal significance, really, the premise of structuralism as a means of evaluating the world, the ways we think about the world, becomes quite hollow for him. But that's not to say that the Mythology project was for nothing, it's quite the contrary. As I said earlier, Barthes has always been a structuralist thinker working against structure. So with this new outlook, this realization, how did he propose we go about working against, resisting these myths? Essentially, it's by welcoming post-structuralist practices. He later says that analyzing and deconstructing myths wasn't enough. Instead of trying to promote a healthier use of science without myth, one must try to destroy the science itself. Indeed, since the publication of Mythologie, we've seen that demystifying myth just doesn't work, right? It actually gives it a greater freedom. In the past, one could embarrass politicians by accusing them of putting on airs, of putting on an appearance. But as demystification became more frequent, the embarrassment diminished, and now we have candidates' aides publicly discussing how they're repairing the candidate's image. Barthes knew that myth was protean, ever-changing, and he was aware of this from the very start. The Hegelian in me thinks that there was always a post-structuralist kernel in even his most outwardly structuralist works. He says that in Mythology, in the 50s, he says that myth is a language which does not want to die. It rests from the meanings which give it sustenance and insidious, degraded survival. It provokes in them an artificial reprieve in which it settles comfortably, turning language into speaking corpses. So let's return to the earlier question. If unveiling myth isn't enough, what does he say will work? In his later text, Ecclesia text, Barthes posits that a radical, purposeful subversion of signs, of intentional subversive reading or misreadings of signs, is one such way of defanging the power of myth. He writes, what I enjoy in a narrative, in reading, is not directly its contents or even its structure, but rather the abrasions I impose upon the fine surface. I read on, I skip, I look up, I dip in again. Remember, for Barthes, everything is text, not just books. Thus, the play of signs evolved in this kind of reading in fields such as the internet, where each user is aware they are appropriating and redeploying signs, ironically, in the postmodern tradition, I guess, would be seen for Barthes as good, as resisting myth. Barthes develops this myth further and delves deeper into post-structuralism by considering the limitations of not just signs and symbols, but their concomitant dependency on beliefs of constancy and pure truth, pure ideals. In 1966, he traveled to Japan, where he wrote L'Empire des Signes, which was a meditation on Japanese culture's contentment and the absence of this transcendental signified. And the book reads like a parody of one of those early French anthropologists' notebooks. Instead of the white imperialists sailing, to the Far East, where fetish is the main mode of viewing or reading, in Barthes' case, he comes to Japan to discover an already extant empire of empty signs. And hence the book represents a kind of undoing of the structuralist enterprise. The book is an allegorical confession of the crisis and limitations of structuralism. The more salient feature that Barthes detects in Japan is that there is no emphasis on a great focus point, this transcendental signifier that I mentioned, by which to judge all of the standards. There's no transcendental signifier governed by the logic of capital or nation necessarily, though that might have changed since he wrote it in the 60s. Instead, in Japan, there's this great prevalence of the empty sign. Barthes shows repeatedly throughout the text how signs in Japan are void of their signified. So what does he mean by this? Despite their signifier suggesting or even playing with meaningfulness in Japan, there is nothing really to be unearthed in these empty signs. The motif of the empty sign is played out in each section of the text. For example, the structure of Tokyo itself is centered around the inaccessible empty space of the Forbidden Palace, the Emperor's Palace. It's not a great overbearing entity, but instead a calm, non-descriptive presence, avoided and unconsidered by its inhabitants. Most streets in Japan also have no name, using a completely different addressing system. Is this not the opposite of the West? Quadrangular, reticulated cities, Los Angeles, for example. Japan short circuits our Western sentiment of the city. Again, he's reading the city as a text, which requires that any urban space have a center to go to return from a point of origin of truth by which to read the city. So, while Barthes' earlier mythology may be viewed as a cautionary tale of traditional modes of reading in a world pervaded by myth, L'Empire des Signes, his later post-structuralist work, rehabilitates meaning and interpretation, becoming particularly interested in the pleasure and jouissance that can arise out of reading and the proliferation of meaning. By creating a space in which pleasure is an essential element of his writing, Barthes presents the play of the signifier not as restless angst as it is in the West, but an opportunity for freedom, creativity, and enjoyment. And Barthes' suggestion for how we should read is not to live dogmatically, but instead through example. This refusal to say explicitly what he means by the empty sign, in some sense, enacts the very feature he's demonstrating. Never quite grasping any core of his idea, but accumulating a sense of it through various impressions. For Barthes, signs in Japan could exist on their own merit, retaining only the significance naturally imbued by their signifiers, resisting mutation into myth, which populates our culture and language itself. The next step in the right direction for Barthes, then, no doubt informed by his visit to Japan, would be to announce the death of the author in his seminal text. But that might be another talk. I'll leave it there.